The house on Maple Street had become too quiet, once filled with the echoes of teenage laughter and the rhythmic pounding of running footsteps. It now held only the soft whir of wheelchair wheels and the crushing weight of unspoken pain. For 14-year-old Ethan, the world had shrunk to the confines of four walls since the accident 3 months ago. Each day blurred into the next, a monotonous cycle of existence rather than living. Daniel watched his son from the kitchen doorway, his coffee growing cold in his hands. Ethan sat by the window, as he did most days, staring blankly at the neighborhood kids playing basketball, a game he had once loved. The wheelchair beside him might as well have been an insurmountable wall, separating him from the life he once knew. "Want to try getting some fresh air today?" Daniel asked, keeping his voice light. The question had become part of their daily routine. Met with Ethan's unchanging response, a slight shake of his head, his eyes never leaving the window. The accident had happened on a Tuesday afternoon, just 2 blocks from their house. A distracted driver, a moment's inattention, and just like that, Ethan's life had changed forever. The doctors had been cautiously optimistic. With intensive physical therapy, recovery was possible. But Ethan's spirit had shattered long before his body could begin to heal. Daniel ran a hand through his graying hair, the weight of single parenthood pressing down on him harder than ever. He had lost his wife, Claire, to cancer 10 years ago, and had dedicated himself to giving Ethan the best life possible. Now, watching his once vibrant son retreat further into himself each day, he felt like he was failing them both. "Your friends asked about you again," Daniel ventured, setting his coffee down. "Jake and Ryan said they could come over, maybe bring that new video game you were talking about before." "I'm tired, Dad," Ethan cut him off, his voice flat and rehearsed. "Maybe another time." Dr. Rivera, the physical therapist, had warned about this. The psychological barriers can be harder to overcome than the physical ones, she'd explained during their last session. He needs to find something to fight for, something to make him want to put in the hard work of recovery. Daniel looked around their living room, now rearranged to accommodate Ethan's needs. The furniture had been pushed aside to create wide paths for the wheelchair. A newly installed lift stood by the stairs. Everything was practical, functional, and yet somehow soul-crushingly sterile. Memories of a different Ethan haunted every corner of the house. Basketball trophies still lined the shelves, alongside photos of a grinning boy in various team jerseys. Just 6 months ago, Ethan had been talking about trying out for the high school varsity team. Now, those dreams sat collecting dust, much like the basketball in the garage that Daniel couldn't bring himself to put away. The hardest part was dinner time. They used to share their days over Claire's old recipes, keeping her memory alive through the meals she had taught Daniel to cook. Now, Ethan picked at his food in silence, responding to his father's attempts at conversation with one-word answers. "Your mum would know what to do," Daniel whispered to himself one evening, after yet another failed attempt to engage Ethan. He found himself doing that more often lately, talking to Claire in quiet moments, hoping for some kind of guidance. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine physical therapy session. Ethan had simply refused to participate, turning his face away from Dr. Rivera's encouraging words and Daniel's gentle prodding. "I can't help him if he's given up." Dr. Rivera had pulled Daniel aside afterward, her face etched with concern. "He needs to find his motivation, again his reason to push through this. The potential for recovery is there, but he has to want it." That night, Daniel sat in the kitchen long after Ethan had gone to bed. surrounded by pamphlets on depression in trauma patients and teen counseling services. The sound of Ethan's wheelchair moving in the room above another sleepless night made his heart ache. Ethan's school had been understanding, arranging for home, tutoring, and remote learning options. But even that was a struggle. His teachers reported that Ethan, once an engaged and enthusiastic student, now barely participated. His grades were slipping not from lack of ability, but from a profound disengagement with life itself. The few times Jake and Ryan had visited, the interactions had been awkward and strained. They tried their best, these good-hearted teenagers, but Ethan's withdrawal was like a physical force pushing them away. Eventually, the visits became less frequent, though they still texted and called messages that largely went unanswered. Daniel found himself studying his son when Ethan wasn't looking, trying to reconcile the quiet, withdrawn boy with the energetic teenager from just months ago. The changes weren't just emotional. Ethan had lost weight, his natural athletic build giving way to something more fragile. The spark in his eyes, so like his mother's, had dimmed to a flat, distant gaze. Late one night, Daniel found himself in the family room, flipping through old photo albums. Pictures of Ethan learning to walk, Claire holding his hands as he took his first stumbling steps. Photos of birthday parties, soccer games, family vacations moments, full of life and joy that now felt like scenes from another family's life. Then, a particular photo caught his eye, much younger Ethan at a petting zoo. His face lit up with pure joy as he played with a group of puppies. Something stirred in Daniel's memory. Ethan had always begged for a dog when he was younger, but between Claire's illness and everything that followed, it had never seemed like the right time. Looking at that photo, something clicked in Daniel's mind. Maybe what Ethan needed wasn't another therapy session or counseling appointment. Maybe he needed something or someone who could reach him in a way that humans couldn't right now. The idea took root, growing stronger as Daniel watched Ethan through another silent breakfast. Perhaps it was time to bring some new life into their too quiet house. He just hoped he wasn't too late to help his son find his way back to the world. The city animal shelter hummed with the chaotic energy of hopeful adopters. When Daniel pushed through the glass doors, the air carried a mingled scent of disinfectant, wet fur, and the faint metallic temps of cages. His palms were damp against the folder of printed research, pages upon pages of dog breeds, temperament charts, and care guides that had kept him awake until 3 a.m. What if he chose wrong? What if this entire idea backfired? First time adopting. A woman's voice cut through his spiraling thoughts. Maggie's namatag gleamed under the fluorescent lights as she approached, her smile crinkling the corners of eyes that held the same quiet warmth Claire's once had. The resemblance was so striking Daniel's breath caught. Yes, he managed, fingers tightening around his overstuffed folder. It's for my son, The words tangled in his throat. How could he explain the hollow-eyed boy who'd once raced across basketball courts, but now barely left his wheelchair? The child who seemed to be fading before his eyes. Maggie's expression softened with understanding that needed no explanation. You know, she said, gently touching his arm, sometimes the right dog finds you rather than the other way around. Her hand moved to a wall covered in Polaroids, grinning families with their new pets. See that lab mix? His family came in looking for a small lap dog. That terrier, they swore they wanted a big running companion. The heart knows what it needs. As they walked through the kennels, the noise crescendoed, a symphony of barks, whines, and the occasional howl. Daniel's head swam as eager paws rattled cage doors. A majestic German shepherd eyed him with intelligent intensity. A bounding golden retriever puppy practically vibrated with joy. These were the kinds of dogs he'd imagined, active companions who might draw Ethan back into the world through sheer energy alone. Then they turned a corner, and the chaos faded. In the last kennel on the left sat a fawn-colored pug, his wrinkled face resting on his paws as he watched the world go by with the solemn dignity of a philosopher king. While other dogs clamored for attention, this one simply waited. "This is Winston," Maggie said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. She knelt, and the pug's curled tail gave 3 deliberate thumps against the kennel floor. "He was tied to our gate 3 months ago with nothing but this." She produced a weathered red bandana from her pocket. No note, no explanation, just this little guy shivering in the rain. Daniel found himself crouching too, drawn by the dog's unusually focused gaze. Winston's dark, liquid eyes seemed to look right through him, seeing not just the anxious father before him, but the broken boy waiting at home. When Maggie opened the kennel, Winston didn't burst out like the others had. He stood, stretched with surprising grace, and walked directly to Daniel, sitting just close enough that his warm flank brushed against Daniel's knee. "He's smaller than I imagined," Daniel admitted, running a hand over Winston's smooth coat. The pug leaned into the touch with a contented sigh, his entire body radiating calm assurance. Maggie chuckled. "Don't let the size fool you. Pugs were bred to be companion dogs for Chinese emperors, you know. They have this uncanny sense for people who need them." She scratched behind Winston's ears, "and they're stubborn in the best possible way. Once they decide you're theirs, nothing will change their mind." The adoption paperwork blurred before Daniel's eyes. Was he really doing this, bringing a stranger into their fragile world? But when he looked down at the carrier in the passenger seat, Winston gazed back with such serene certainty that Daniel's doubts quieted. "I hope this isn't a mistake," he whispered as they pulled into the driveway. Winston responded with a soft harumph that sounded almost like disagreement. The house was tomb silent, as usual. Through the living room doorway, Daniel could see Ethan's silhouette framed by the window, motionless in his wheelchair. The basketball court across the street, where neighborhood kids played, might as well have been on another planet. "Ethan," Daniel called softly, setting down the carrier. "There's someone I'd like you to meet." The wheelchair didn't turn. "Dad, I told you, I'm not up for visitors." Ethan's voice was flat, the same rehearsed line from a script they'd been reading from for months. Winston solved the problem in his own way, with a determined snuffle. He pushed his way out of the carrier and marched into the living room with the dignity of a diplomat on an important mission. Daniel watched, heart pounding, as the pug stopped precisely 2 feet from Ethan's wheelchair and sat down with an audible plop. Ethan finally turned, his hollowed face shifting from annoyance to confusion. "What, ... Is this is Winston?" Daniel kept his voice light, though his hands trembled. "He needed a home, and I thought, maybe we could help each other out." For a long moment, Ethan just stared at the dog. Daniel could practically see the walls going up, the same defenses that had kept therapists, teachers, and friends at bay. "I don't need a dog, Dad," he said, tonelessly. "I can barely take care of myself." But Winston, as Maggie had promised, was stubborn. He didn't jump or bark or demand. He simply ... stayed. When Ethan wheeled himself to the kitchen, Winston followed at a respectful distance. When the boy retreated to his room, the pug settled outside his door like a tiny, wrinkled sentinel. That night, Daniel lay awake, staring at the ceiling when a sound caught his attention. The soft creak of Ethan's wheelchair moving down the hall. Peering through his cracked door, he saw his son in the moonlight, gently stroking Winston's head. "You're not very good at taking hints, are you?" Ethan murmured, his voice carrying the faintest hint of warmth Daniel hadn't heard in months. Winston responded by licking Ethan's fingers, and Daniel had to press a hand to his mouth when he saw, in the silver light, the barest shadow of a smile on his son's face. In the kitchen, Daniel found Maggie's business card and dialed with shaking fingers. "It's working," he whispered when she answered, his voice breaking. "I think it's really working." On the other end of the line, Maggie's smile was audible. "I told you," she said gently. "The heart knows what it needs." The first few days settled into an uneasy rhythm. Ethan remained withdrawn, speaking only when necessary. Winston, however, developed his own quiet routine, always nearby, never intrusive. He learned where Ethan spent most of his time, positioning himself under the study desk, during tutoring sessions, or beside the wheelchair during the physical therapy exercises Ethan barely attempted. Daniel watched with growing anxiety. Had he made things worse? Was this just another burden on Ethan's already heavy shoulders? But then small moments, fleeting, almost imperceptible. A glance from Ethan when he thought no one was looking. A hesitant pause when Winston nudged his hand with a cold nose. Then, on the fourth night, Daniel woke to an unusual sound. Following it, he found Ethan in the kitchen, his wheelchair pulled up to the sink. Winston sat beside him, and for the first time since the accident Ethan was talking, really talking. "You're pretty stubborn, aren't you?" Ethan murmured, his voice soft as he reached down to touch the pug's head for the first time. "Following me around all day, even though I've been ignoring you." Daniel stayed hidden in the shadows, his heart pounding. Winston leaned into Ethan's touch, and for a moment, brief but unmistakable, Daniel saw the ghost of a smile on his son's face. It wasn't much, but it was something. A crack in the wall Ethan had built around himself. As Daniel slipped back to bed, he heard Ethan's quiet voice continue, sharing midnight confidences with his new friend. Maybe, just maybe, this unlikely little dog could help his son find his way back to life. Change came in fragments, like pieces of a puzzle slowly clicking into place. The first real breakthrough happened at breakfast a week later. Ethan, who had been eating mechanically for months, dropped a piece of toast. Before anyone could react, Winston lunged forward, snapping it from mid-hand, making such a comical face that Ethan actually laughed. The sound was so unexpected that Daniel nearly dropped his coffee cup. It was small, rusted from disuse, but it was real. Ethan looked almost surprised at himself, as if he'd forgotten he was capable of such a sound. Winston, encouraged, placed his front paws on the wheelchair, tilting his head in that peculiar pug way that made his wrinkles even more expressive. "You're not supposed to beg," Ethan said, but there was warmth in his voice that hadn't been there in months. He glanced at Daniel. "Can he have treats?" Daniel nearly tripped over himself, getting to the cupboard where he'd stored the dog biscuits. "Just one or two," he said, his voice thick with emotion. It was the first thing Ethan had actively asked for in months. The transformation began in small, nearly imperceptible ways, like the first green shoots pushing through winter soil. Mornings, once silent except for the hum of the wheelchair motor, now carried the soft patter of Winston's paws on hardwood floors. The pug had appointed himself Ethan's personal alarm clock, standing on his hind legs to rest his front paws on the bed. Each morning, his wet nose nudging at Ethan's hand until fingers automatically curled into his warm fur. Breakfast became a shared ritual, where Ethan used to pick at meals alone in his room. Now Winston would trot purposefully to the kitchen table, looking back over his shoulder with an expectant expression that somehow managed to say, "Well, aren't you coming?" And Ethan, against all odds, would follow during online classes, which Ethan had previously endured in mute disengagement. Winston stationed himself like a furry supervisor beneath the desk. When Ethan's attention drifted during math problems, a persistent paw would bat at his ankle. When history lectures dragged on, Winston would rest his chin on Ethan's knee with an audible sigh, as if to say, "Pay attention already so we can play." He's like a furry alarm clock. Ethan complained one afternoon after Winston dragged the forgotten resistance bands across the room with determined little grunts. The eye roll was automatic, but Daniel didn't miss how Ethan's fingers lingered in Winston's neck folds, or how the boy's shoulders relaxed just slightly under the dog's steady gaze. Dr. Rivera noticed the changes immediately during their next session, where Ethan had once resisted even the simplest stretches. Now he reached further, pushed harder, especially when Winston positioned himself just out of reach, his favorite toy clutched in his jaws like a furry physical therapist's prop. "Remarkable," Dr. Rivera murmured as she watched Ethan stretch to scratch behind Winston's ears during a particularly challenging exercise. Dogs don't see limitations, only possibilities. They live entirely in the present moment, and somehow, they pull us into it with them. Winston seemed to possess an almost supernatural sense for Ethan's darkest hours. On mornings when pain made the simple act of getting dressed an ordeal, the pug would station himself by the wheelchair, his solid little body leaning against Ethan's legs, as if lending his own strength. When frustration boiled over during failed therapy exercises, Winston would press his entire weight along Ethan's side, his warm, weaving, tangible reminder to just keep going. The real breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Daniel paused outside Ethan's half-open door, hearing the soft murmur of his son's voice, not the monotone responses he'd grown accustomed to, but something raw and vulnerable. "I'm scared, Winston." The words were so quiet Daniel had to hold his breath to hear. What if this is as good as it gets? What if I'm always just broken? The silence that followed was punctuated by the sound of claws on hardwood, then the distinctive creak of the wheelchair as Winston, defying all his training about not climbing on furniture, somehow managed to scramble into Ethan's lap, not just resting against him, but pressing his entire compact body against the boy's chest, his heartbeat steady against Ethan's racing one. Daniel watched through the crack in the door as his son's arms came up automatically, fingers burying themselves in Winston's fur. And then, for the first time since the accident, since the hospital, since the world had collapsed around them, Ethan cried. Not the silent tears of pain, but great heaving sobs that shook his entire frame. His face pressed into Winston's neck as the dog sat motionless, absorbing every shuddering breath. Later, when Daniel checked on them, he found Ethan asleep in his chair, Winston still curled protectively in his lap. The boy's face, though tear-streaked, looked more at peace than Daniel had seen in months. And Winston, that wise, wonderful creature, lifted his head just enough to meet Daniel's gaze, his dark eyes seeming to say, "It's okay, I've got him now." That night, Daniel dug out an old photo album, turning to a picture of Claire holding a toddler, Ethan at the zoo, both of them laughing as a puppy licked Ethan's face. He touched his wife's smiling face lightly. "You always said we'd know when it was time," he whispered. "I think you sent him, didn't you?" From the hallway came the sound of Winston's collar jingling as he patrolled between Ethan's room and Daniel's. Their tiny, steadfast guardian keeping watch over his fractured family. For the first time in a long time, the house on Maple Street didn't feel quite so empty. The transformation rippled outward, like stones skipping across the surface of their lives. One evening, Daniel walked past Ethan's room and heard something extraordinary. The familiar ping of text notifications, followed by his son's quiet laughter. The sound was so foreign that Daniel had to lean against the wall to steady himself. Through the cracked door, he saw Ethan's phone screen illuminated with a string of messages from Jake and Ryan. Winston curled in the crook of his arm like a living security blanket as Ethan typed responses with thumbs that had grown more sure by the day when the boys came over that weekend. The air crackled with the awkwardness of months of distance. Ryan hovered near the door like he might bolt, while Jake kept glancing at Ethan's wheelchair, as if it might bite him. Then Winston, that miraculous little diplomat, trotted over with his favorite stuffed hedgehog and dropped it squarely on Jake's foot. When Jake bent to pick it up, Winston snatched it back with a playful growl, his entire rear end wagging with the effort. "Okay, that's just rude," Jake laughed, and just like that, the ice cracked. Soon they were all howling as Winston demonstrated his victory lap routine, tearing around the living room with his hedgehog. Prize after Ethan successfully completed his arm exercises. "He's like a tiny, wrinkled cheerleader," Ryan gasped between laughs, wiping his eyes as Winston attempted to climb onto Ethan's lap without releasing his toy, resulting in an undignified faceplant that sent them all into fresh peals of laughter. Ethan's smile, in that moment, genuine and unguarded, was something Daniel would commit to memory forever. It wasn't just the curve of his lips, but the way his eyes crinkled at the corners, the way his shoulders relaxed for the first time in months. Winston, sensing his victory, promptly collapsed across Ethan's feet with a contented sigh. The changes multiplied like spring wildflowers. Mornings now began with the sound of Ethan's wheelchair moving independently to his dresser, where he'd actually debate outfits instead of accepting whatever Daniel laid out. One remarkable Tuesday, Daniel walked in to find Ethan struggling into his old basketball jersey, the one he'd sworn he'd never wear again. Winston sat proudly beside him, tail thumping as if to say, "Look at us, making progress." Dinner requests started appearing on the fridge notepad in Ethan's messy scrawl. "Can we have Mum's meatloaf tonight?" The first time Daniel saw that note, he had to excuse himself to the bathroom to compose himself. That evening, as the familiar aroma filled the house, Ethan actually lingered at the table after eating, Winston in his lap, and asked about Daniel's workday, a simple question that felt like a miracle. The wheelchair's meaning transformed before Daniel's eyes. No longer a symbol of limitation, it became Ethan's chariot as he and Winston explored the neighborhood. Daniel would watch from the window as his son practiced popping wheelies over curbs, Winston trotting alongside with the focused intensity of a service dog. Their evening walks became sacred, Ethan navigating with increasing confidence, Winston sniffing at fire hydrants with equal parts dignity and absurdity. The breakthrough came after a particularly grueling therapy session. Sweat dripped from Ethan's brow as he collapsed back into his chair, muscles trembling from exertion. Dr. Rivera was saying something encouraging, but Ethan's gaze was fixed on Winston, who sat panting beside the parallel bars with what could only be described as pride. "I want to try something new," Ethan said suddenly, cutting through the chatter. His voice was quiet but firm, the way it used to sound when he'd announce he was trying out for another sports team. I think I'm ready to work harder." Daniel's breath caught. It wasn't just the words, but the way Ethan's hand found Winston's head almost unconsciously, drawing strength from that steady presence. As Ethan wheeled himself toward the therapy mat, with Winston keeping perfect pace beside him, Daniel understood with sudden clarity. Winston hadn't just given Ethan companionship, he'd given him back his future. The pug's unwavering belief in Ethan had become a mirror, reflecting back the boy's own strength, until Ethan could finally see it for himself. That night, Daniel dug out the old camcorder from the hall closet. Through the viewfinder, he captured Ethan in the backyard, laughing as Winston attempted to help with his exercises by standing directly under him during stretches. The footage was shaky, but the transformation was unmistakable. Where there had once been a hollow-eyed ghost of a boy, now sat a young man with fire in his eyes and a pug-shaped shadow by his side. As Daniel zoomed in on Ethan's face, alive, with determination and something dangerously close to hope, he realized Winston had given him something precious too: the courage to believe in miracles again. 1 year after the accident, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, the impossible happened. Ethan stood not leaning on parallel bars, not braced between crutches, just stood bare feet planted on the living room carpet, knees trembling but holding, his hands hovering in the air like he wasn't quite sure what to do with them. Daniel nearly dropped the phone. He'd been pretending not to film with when Ethan's left foot slid forward. Then the right, a breath, another step. They were the most beautiful, unsteady steps Daniel had ever seen. Winston erupted into action before Daniel could even process what was happening. The pug launched into his victory dance with such enthusiasm. He nearly toppled over, spinning in frantic circles, snorting like a tiny steam engine, his curled tail vibrating with joy. Ethan's laughter rang out, bright and startled, as Winston barreled into his ankles in celebration, nearly knocking them both over. That night, Daniel replayed the video 17 times. Each viewing revealed new miracles. The way Ethan's fingers had automatically stretched toward Winston for balance. The exact moment when his son's expression shifted from concentration to stunned joy. Winston's proud prance afterward, as if he'd personally orchestrated the whole thing. Curled on the couch together later, Ethan's legs stretched out stiffly, Winston draped across his lap like a living heating pad. Daniel heard his son murmur into the pug's fur, "We did it, buddy. We really did it." Winston responded by licking the tear track from Ethan's cheek with a noise that sounded suspiciously like "I know." 18 months later, the scent of fresh-cut grass and the rhythmic squeak of sneakers on asphalt filled the air as Ethan stood at the edge of the basketball court. His fingers tapped an absent rhythm against his thigh, nervous habit Winston had somehow trained out of him by persistently nudging that hand onto his own head for scratches instead. Daniel's throat tightened, watching his son lace up the shoes Claire had bought him for his last birthday before the accident. The same shoes that had sat untouched in the closet for over a year. "You sure about this?" Daniel asked, gripping the water bottle too tightly. Ethan's smile was lopsided, but sure as he reached down to adjust Winston's bandana, the same red one he'd been found with at the shelter. "Coach says I can play quarter-court games. Start slow. Build up strength." He paused, his hand finding its familiar place behind Winston's ears. "Besides, "I've got my good luck charm." As Ethan moved onto the court, his gait still careful, his shots no longer perfect arcs, but determined pushes from his rebuilt muscles, Daniel noticed how the other players instinctively adjusted. Not with pity, but with the unspoken understanding of teammates. When Ethan stumbled after a particularly ambitious pivot, Winston was there before anyone else could react, planting himself solidly against Ethan's leg like a furry anchor. From the bleachers, Dr. Rivera appeared at Daniel's side, her eyes bright. "Medical journals will tell you recovery like this is about neural pathways and muscle memory," she said quietly as they watched Ethan sink his first basket. But they never mention the most important ingredient: on the court. Winston let out an enthusiastic boof as the ball swished through the net, his stubby tail wagging hard enough to shake his entire body. Ethan grinned, that full, unguarded grin Daniel had feared might be lost forever, and bent to high-five his tiniest teammate. Daniel finally understood what Dr. Rivera meant. Science could explain the healing of bones and tissue, but only love could account for the way Ethan's spirit had mended alongside his body. The transformation went beyond physical therapy, in the way his son now greeted mornings with purpose instead of resignation. How he'd begun leaving his bedroom door open like an unspoken invitation. The quiet confidence with which he'd started mentoring other kids at the rehabilitation center. All of it traced back to 12 pounds of stubborn devotion that snored at the foot of his bed each night. On the court, Winston maintained his perfect sentry position between Ethan and the bench, his wrinkled face alternating between focused intensity and sudden bursts of tail-wagging enthusiasm whenever Ethan made contact with the ball. Daniel watched as his son missed a three-pointer, then laughed, actually laughed, at his own stumble, ruffling Winston's ears when the pug trotted over to check on him. That sound, more than any medical milestone, told Daniel the healing was complete. The late afternoon sun painted everything gold as Daniel's fingers brushed the worn edges of the photo in his pocket. Claire holding a 2-year-old Ethan at the petting zoo, their faces alight with identical joy as puppies swarmed around them. The ache was still there, but softer now, layered with new memories. Ethan teaching Winston to shake using bite-sized pieces of hot dog. The pug's solemn determination during therapy sessions, the way he'd positioned himself under Ethan's trembling legs during those first impossible attempts at standing. Water break. The coach called, and Daniel watched as Ethan made his way to the sidelines, his gait still careful but steady. Winston immediately pressed against his left leg. Not for support, Daniel realized, but simply because that was there. Way now. The sight of Ethan casually scratching Winston's ears while chatting with teammates would have been unimaginable a year ago. That evening, as leaf shadows danced across the living room walls, they found themselves poring over old photos. Albums again. Winston lay sprawled across Ethan's lap like a contented sphinx, his chin propped on a picture of Claire's last birthday celebration. "She would have loved him," Ethan murmured, his finger tracing the edge of a photo where Claire grinned behind. A cake crowded with candles. Winston exhaled a dramatic sigh, as if agreeing, making them both chuckle. The sound blended with the cicadas' evening song beyond the windows, a perfect harmony of past and present. Daniel felt something unknot in his chest. Claire's absence would always be there, but now so was this. Ethan's smile lines deepening. As Winston licked his elbow, the comfortable silence between them no longer fraught with unsaid grief. "Your mum always believed things happened for reasons we might not understand right away," he said, accepting the pug's slobbery tennis ball when it was dropped at his feet. Later, In the backyard's twilight, the basketball arced through the hoop. With a satisfying swish, Winston executed his signature celebration. 3 frantic circles, followed by an enthusiastic faceplant into the grass. As Ethan turned, sweat damp but glowing. "You know what, Dad?" he said, catching the rebound, with hands that no longer shook. "I think Winston needed us as much as we needed him." Daniel watched the two of them, his son standing tall in the fading light, their miracle dog covered in grass stains and triumph, and understood this was the real victory. Not just the physical recovery, but the way love had grown in the broken places, knitting them back together differently but no less beautifully. As Winston demonstrated his best trick, balancing a biscuit on his nose before flipping it into Ethan's waiting palm, Daniel thought of all the small miracles that had brought them here, the shelter volunteer who'd seen what they needed, the way Winston had chosen Ethan as much as they'd chosen him. Those first terrible months, when the pug's steady presence had been the only thing anchoring them to hope. The neighbors probably wondered why Daniel suddenly laughed aloud in the quiet backyard. But how else do you respond when life hands you a second chance wrapped in a snoring, snorting, endlessly loving package? Somewhere beyond the fence, a child's laughter floated on the summer air, blending with the sound of the basketball's rhythmic dribbling and Winston's contented snap as he trailed after his boy. The story continues in the quiet moments, in Winston's insistence on helping with Ethan's morning stretches, the way he still stations himself protectively beside the wheelchair on Ethan's tired days, the growing collection of kids at the rehab center who request the pug therapist for their sessions, and every night, without fail, the weight of a small warm body curled between them. A living reminder that sometimes the most powerful healers come on for pause, with enough love to mend even the most broken of places. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more Fireside Tales. Also, share your own stories of animals in the comments below. As a pet ever helped you through a difficult time? How do they show you the way forward when you couldn't see it yourself?